My husband and his mom faked their identities to rob my family blind. They didn't know I was a financial crimes investigator. Here's how I ruined them. I had exactly 28 minutes before the glass elevator reached the sprawling marble lobby of the Sapphire Cove Resort, and I spent every single one of those agonizing seconds cataloging evidence in my head the way I'd been trained to do for the past 9 years. Full name: Julian Vance, alias Leo Sterling. Wife, not mother: Valerie Vance, alias Vera Sterling, using a fraudulent divorce decree. The case number for their documents was lifted from a Clark County parking citation. A holding company, barely 3 days old, was filed the exact same week my father transferred the deed of the Oak Haven estate into my name as a lavish wedding gift. Neither of them had known about that transfer until the notary called to confirm it. That was the missing piece they didn't have. The piece that made this entire elaborate, sickening performance necessary. If they'd known about the transfer earlier, they wouldn't have needed a wedding at all. They could have just waited for probate. Leo's thumb moved in slow, comforting circles on the back of my hand while the red LED numbers of the elevator ticked down. 12, 11, 10. He was quietly humming something under his breath. It took me a moment to recognize it as the song from our first dance just 4 months ago in a rented ballroom that his mother, his wife, had picked out specifically because it photographed well. I let myself feel it, the pure, unadulterated anger. Just for a second in that mirrored metal box, I let the rage move through my chest like something physical, sharp and suffocating. I had to let it out now, because investigator Sarah Jenkins had told me on a secure line 40 minutes earlier that suppressing it completely would make me look rehearsed, and rehearsed people got caught. "You're awfully quiet this morning," Leo said, his voice smooth and entirely unbothered. "I'm just nervous," I lied, forcing a tight smile. "It's a lot of overwhelming paperwork for a Tuesday morning." "That's marriage, sweetheart," Vera's voice echoed from the corner of the elevator, dry as chalk and dripping with a manufactured maternal warmth. Paperwork and endless patience. The heavy doors opened. I walked out first. I'd confidently told the registrar earlier that morning that I didn't need police protection inside the resort. I was dead wrong about that, and that arrogance would almost cost me absolutely everything just 11 hours later. But at 9:14 that morning, walking across lobby marble, the color of wet sand, toward a notary's office that didn't even exist yet, I genuinely believed I had the entire situation controlled. To understand how I ended up in this nightmare, you need to know who I am. I am a forensic examiner for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Before Julian Vance entered my life, that meant something very specific and incredibly narrow. I traced dirty money for a living. I hunted down shell companies, untangled layered offshore wires, and exposed the small, arrogant, mathematical lies that desperate people tell when they think no one with my specialized training is looking. I was exceptionally good at my job, which, in a sick twist of irony, made me uniquely bad at recognizing when someone was running the exact same fraudulent playbook on me personally. You'd think 9 years of catching professional liars would make you suspicious of absolutely everyone. It doesn't. It makes you suspicious of everyone except the person sleeping next to you, because your tired brain has decided that's the one single category of person exempt from the rigid rules you enforce professionally. Leo, I'm going to keep calling him that for now because that's the man I stupidly fell for, came into my life the way competent frauds always do, through a door that looked completely ordinary. We met at a charity gala for my father's marina renovation project about 8 months ago. He said he worked in coastal real estate advisory, a vague title, which I now know meant absolutely nothing. It was attached to no state license, no legitimate firm, and no verifiable client list. His mother, he claimed, had raised him entirely alone in Boston after his father died tragically young. Vera was warm in that specific, overbearing way that reads like a comforting blanket to a woman who lost her own mother at 22. She felt like something I had been subconsciously missing. I want to be brutally honest about the red flags because I've thought about them every single day since, and I owe it to anyone reading this who might be where I was. There were exactly 3 major red flags, and I managed to explain away every single one of them. The first was that Leo never, not even once in 8 months, let me see his phone unlocked. He always laughed it off as boring corporate security or just dull work stuff. The second was that Vera's tearful stories about his childhood changed in small, subtle ways. A quaint house in Boston suddenly became a townhouse in Portland, and then mysteriously became an apartment in Boston again. I stupidly told myself that deep grief simply does that to a person's memory. The third, and the one that absolutely should have ended everything right then and there, was that he proposed a mere 7 months after we met. He looked me in the eyes and told me the speed was simply because some things you just know in your soul. And I, a woman who spends her entire professional life deeply distrusting exactly that kind of frantic urgency, let myself believe it about my own life because it felt so intoxicating to be chosen. My father, Arthur Pendleton, tried to raise his concerns once over a tense dinner 4 months before the wedding. "Fast is fine when it's real," he said, swirling his wine glass. "Fast is a strategy when it isn't," I snapped at him. I told him he was being overly protective in a way that was starting to feel suffocating and controlling. He immediately backed off, because that's exactly what good fathers do when their stubbornly independent daughters are 32 and building their own lives. I've since learned that my harsh reaction was exactly the sentence he needed to hear to know he was entirely right, and to start quietly making discreet calls of his own. Calls that would matter enormously, 11 hours after my wedding, though neither of us knew it yet. What I didn't know until much later was that my father had secretly hired a retired colleague of his, a grizzled private investigator who used to do deep dive due diligence for his marina's commercial insurers, to run a comprehensive background check on Leo sometime around month 5. The investigator came back with nothing conclusive. There was absolutely no criminal record under the name Leo Sterling, simply because there was no such person to even have a record. My father, not wanting to falsely accuse a man of non-existence based solely on an absence of paperwork, filed the thick report away in his study. He told himself he'd raised his concern once, and that would have to be enough to protect me. He showed me that heartbreaking report the week after the arrest, practically in tears, apologizing profusely for not pushing harder. I told him the exact same thing I tell anyone in his difficult position. An absence of a criminal record isn't reassurance when the entire crime is that the person doesn't legally exist under the name you're searching. The first real crack in the facade came just 4 days before the wedding, and I foolishly dismissed it inside of 90 seconds. I was sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously proofing wire transfer instructions for our expensive caterer. It was an old habit. I checked everything twice. Suddenly, Leo's phone buzzed loudly on the marble counter, with a text preview I definitely wasn't supposed to see. It was from Vera. "The Oak Haven estate paperwork needs to close before the window closes." The window closes. Not before we leave, or before the trip. It was a highly specific, load-bearing phrase, the exact kind of clinical language people use when they're describing a hard legal deadline that isn't theirs to control. I casually asked him about it that night in bed. He smoothly lied, saying his mother was talking about a messy rental property she managed back east. It had nothing to do with us, he promised, kissing my forehead. I believed him completely, because the horrifying alternative, that my loving fiancé and his sweet mother were eagerly tracking a legal deadline connected to my father's property 4 days before our wedding, required a level of premeditated sociopathic cruelty I genuinely could not picture on the face of a man who had cried actual wet tears during our vows rehearsal. I understand now that those tears were very real. Julian Vance wasn't performing grief or joy. He was performing pure relief. It was the particular emotional high of watching a complex con that had taken months finally click into its ultimate profitable position. I just didn't have the psychological vocabulary yet to tell the two apart. The second crack was much smaller and significantly stranger. 2 days before the wedding, I was looking for a spare phone charger and accidentally found a thick manila folder buried deep in Vera's overnight bag. It was a genuine accident, not snooping, though I know exactly how suspicious that sounds now. Inside the folder were crisp photocopies of my father's private property tax records for 3 coastal parcels I hadn't told either of them about. They were neatly stapled to a printout of my own W-2 from 4 years ago, the one from right before I transferred to the federal examiner role, back when my salary looked much more vulnerable. I confronted her about it the very next morning over coffee. She didn't even blink. She calmly said she'd been proactively helping Leo understand my entire financial picture so he could be a better, more supportive partner. She said it while looking directly into my eyes, with an expression of such warm, unbothered, maternal honesty that I actually found myself apologizing for asking. I want to be very, very clear about something, because I think it's the crucial part people skip when they tell stories like mine for cheap entertainment instead of as a dire warning. I am not an unintelligent woman, and I was not naive by nature. I was systematically targeted by two ruthless professionals who had done this exact routine before. They understood exactly which comforting words would unlock which lingering doubts, and they had 8 full months to study my psychology specifically. That is not a simple failure of judgment on my part. That is what a professional con is. It's meticulously built to survive extreme scrutiny from smart people. Because smart people are usually the ones with something actually worth stealing. Back in the present, at 9:14 a.m. on the morning after my wedding, I walked into a room that my boss, Sarah Jenkins, had hastily arranged on the second floor of the Sapphire Cove Resort. It was tucked away behind the resort's quiet business center. It was an office normally used for high-pressure timeshare closings, repurposed entirely overnight by federal agents. There was a hidden micro camera installed in the thermostat housing, and a second one hidden behind a decorative wall clock that Sarah swore looked exactly like the one that had hung there for years. A terrified resort employee named Maya Patel, who usually ran corporate events and had bravely agreed to play the notary after Detective Miller showed her Julian Vance's horrifying case file, sat stiffly behind the desk. She was wearing a tailored blazer that clearly wasn't hers, nervously practicing a signature stamp she'd never used before in her life. I found out much later that Maya almost backed out twice in the 90 minutes before we arrived. Miller told her the exact same thing he'd told me on the phone at 6 a.m. while I was standing freezing in the hallway outside my own luxurious wedding suite while my new husband slept peacefully 11 feet away. You don't have to be incredibly brave. You just have to be incredibly normal for exactly 20 minutes. Miller had 17 years with the Financial Crimes Unit and a weathered face that gave away absolutely nothing. That was probably why Julian and Valerie Vance walked right past him twice in the lobby that morning, without a single flicker of recognition, even though his photograph was sitting in a manila folder 3 inches from where they now sat. "Miss Sterling," Maya Patel said, her voice shaking slightly as she played the notary, sliding a yellow legal pad toward me. "I'll need to see government identification from both parties, and I'll be reading the property transfer language aloud, per state notary requirements, if that's all right with everyone." "Standard procedure," Leo said smoothly, already reaching confidently for his fake ID. It wasn't standard at all. Notaries almost never read dense transfer language aloud. But Julian Vance had spent his entire adult life brilliantly performing confidence in fancy rooms where nobody ever checked his homework. And he certainly wasn't going to start aggressively checking someone else's now. Maya cleared her throat and read, "The power of attorney, the property transfer, the formation documents for Sterling Coastal Holdings, care of Vera Sterling, registered agent." Every single word she spoke went directly onto a digital recorder hidden deep in my purse. It was backed up by the 2 hidden cameras in the walls, and backed up again by a live audio feed running straight to a folding table in a cramped maintenance closet down the hall. That's where Miller, Sarah, and a brilliant young financial crimes analyst named Kevin Park sat huddled with heavy headphones and a legal pad of their own. "Sign right here," Maya said, pointing a trembling finger at the bottom line. I picked up the heavy black pen. My hand shook violently. Some of that was calculated performance, but most of it was genuine, terrifying adrenaline. Vera's mouth slowly curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was much closer to deep, predatory satisfaction. I understood, watching it happen in real time, that I was looking at an expression she had worn many times before. In other quiet rooms, watching other trusting women's signatures being forged under her son's, her husband's, fake name. I signed my real legal name. Then, beneath it, in the tiny blank space reserved for the second witness, I wrote something Maya had previously agreed to completely overlook. It was not my legal signature, but a single, damning sentence in small, deliberate print. "This transfer is void. Recorded under active investigation. Case 2291-FC." I smoothly slid the page back across the desk before either of the con artists could read it upside down. "All set," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "That's it?" Leo sounded almost intensely disappointed. It was the exact way an arrogant man sounds when a massive task he'd built up in his mind turns out to be pathetically easy. That's it, Maya said, grabbing the papers. I'll file these copies with the county by the end of the day. She absolutely would. Just not the county he was currently thinking of. We stood up to leave. Vera actually hugged me. She wrapped her arms tight around my tense shoulders, pulled me close, and whispered directly into my ear. You're going to be so incredibly happy, honey. I truly mean that. I believed she meant it in the exact same way a ruthless fisherman means it, when he smiles and tells the fish the water is perfectly fine. The moment the heavy wooden door closed behind Maya Patel and her borrowed blazer, I felt the floor of my own life violently tilt one more time. Leo turned to me in the quiet, carpeted hallway and said very quietly, we should move our flight to the islands up to tonight instead of tomorrow morning. Why? I asked, trying to keep my breathing even. Just a gut feeling, he smiled, and I watched his perfect mask physically move a half-inch. It was the very first genuine slip I'd seen from him since this whole nightmare started. You know how it is, babe. I just want to start our new life. Together, before anyone can complicate it. Complicate it. He didn't mean the honeymoon. He meant the paperwork, the massive property transfer. Something deep inside his predatory brain already sensed that the room hadn't felt quite right, even if he couldn't articulate exactly why. Every professional con artist I've since read about in Detective Miller's extensive files describes exactly that primal instinct, the deep, gnawing itch that arrives just before the concrete evidence does. I practically sprinted to the resort's opulent lobby bathroom 4 minutes later. I pressed my back hard against a cold marble sink, my voice pitched just above a frantic whisper as I called Sarah. He wants to move up the flight. Tonight. Right now. Sarah exhaled sharply on the other end, and I heard her aggressively flipping through thick paper files. Listen to me. The wire trace on their offshore shell company needs another 18 hours to subpoena the second Swiss bank. If they leave the country before that subpoena clears, we completely lose the asset freeze. We can't legally detain someone just for wanting an early flight. A heavy pause. You have to slow him down. Can you do that? I looked at my pale reflection in the mirror. My wedding morning makeup was 4 hours old and miraculously still holding together. Yes, I said. I want to skip ahead slightly through the next 6 agonizing hours because most of them were pure logistical torture. It was me desperately inventing ridiculous reasons to delay our hotel checkout. It was me calling my father under the flimsy pretense of profusely thanking him for a wedding gift, just so Miller's tactical team could triangulate whether Julian and Valerie had made outside contact with anyone else that day. It was me, anxiously waiting for Kevin Park's financial analysis to come back. When Kevin's report finally hit Sarah's desk, it showed 4 massive wire attempts already queued up against the Oakhaven deed. 3 of those wires were cleverly routed through a Swiss intermediary account, registered to a name I didn't recognize yet. Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne turned out to be the third devastating piece of the puzzle. Finding him is the part of this story that still makes my hands go ice cold when I think about it, because he was the entire reason the window Vera had texted about existed at all. Kevin Park was 29, just 2 years out of a prestigious master's program in forensic accounting. He was the kind of brilliant analyst who got genuinely, intensely excited about bad actors. He found Silas Thorne's name deeply buried in the incorporation documents for Sterling Coastal Holdings. Thorne was listed not as an owner, but as the registered agent's registered agent. It was a complex legal nesting doll, specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of surface-level scrutiny a distracted, freshly married woman might apply if she ever bothered to. Check. Thorne, it tragically turned out, was a disgraced, disbarred real estate attorney operating out of Georgia. He had been stripped of his license 6 years earlier for facilitating fraudulent property transfers on behalf of at least 2 other couples who fit the exact same sickening pattern as Leo and Vera. A fast, whirlwind marriage, a heavily manufactured family relationship, and a massive property transfer, cleverly disguised as a wedding gift or an estate consolidation. Thorne's role was narrow but vital. He built the fake paperwork that looked completely airtight to a sleepy notary, and shaky but plausible to a first-pass bank compliance officer. That is the exact sweet spot where massive fraud usually slips through, if nobody with professional training looks twice. Kevin showed me his chaotic working notes months later, once the federal case had closed enough that the prosecutor allowed it. I remember being struck by how incredibly unglamorous the actual discovery had been. There was no dramatic computer hacking, no late-night cinematic breakthrough. It was just a tedious habit of his, patiently cross-referencing registered agent addresses against a massive public database of disbarred attorneys in every single state that touched the transaction. He applied it patiently to 4 different filings until one tiny address finally matched. He'd found Thorne by 1:40 that afternoon, and then spent the next 2 hours doing the quiet, grueling work of building a financial timeline strong enough that a federal judge wouldn't need to take anyone's word for it. The scary part was never the fraud itself, Kevin told me over coffee later. It was how incredibly bored the bank compliance officer must have been the day this filing crossed her desk. That's the actual vulnerability. Not cleverness, just human fatigue. That specific detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else in the massive case file, because it meant the terrifying thing that almost cost my father his entire estate wasn't a criminal mastermind outsmarting a robust system. It was just a tired afternoon at a regional bank, multiplied across 3 different states and at least 4 ruined victims, and a fake family willing to keep repeating the exact same script until fatigue did the rest of the work for them. Miller's team had a horrifying name for the broader pattern by early afternoon. 3 prior marriages, 3 different states, 3 different ruined women, all with inherited or family-transferred coastal properties, all conducted by a man using a completely different first name each time, but always the exact same core biography. Dead father, devoted, overbearing mother, vague real estate advisory work that never quite checked out. 2 of the women had lost their properties entirely and were left financially devastated before realizing what happened. The 3rd had bravely gone to the police, only to be patronizingly told by a beat officer in a small coastal town that it sounded like a bad civil divorce, not a criminal matter. Her name was Elena Rostova. She'd lost a beautiful beachfront duplex in Maine 18 months earlier. When Miller's team finally reached her on the phone that afternoon, she didn't ask a single question about the federal investigation. She just asked, her voice cracking, "Is it the exact same woman? Does she still call herself his mother?" It was. By 4 p.m., I was back in the luxurious honeymoon suite, slowly packing a suitcase I had absolutely no intention of ever using. I was buying precious time by loudly insisting we needed a proper, formal send-off dinner with Vera before we left for the airport. It was my absolute last card to play. The one Sarah had begged me to hold in reserve, because a public dinner meant civilian witnesses, and witnesses meant Julian Vance would have to keep performing his role instead of accelerating his escape. "You've been acting very different since this morning," Leo said, leaning against the doorframe, watching me mechanically fold a floral sundress bought for a tropical honeymoon that no longer existed in any reality. "I got married yesterday," I replied, not looking up. "I think I'm allowed to be a little different." He walked over and came up behind me, placing his warm hands gently on my tense shoulders. For one entirely disorienting, pathetic second, I felt the old thing, the warmth, the desperate wanting to believe. It flickered back to life in my chest, and I understood, in that exact moment, exactly how he'd gotten away with this 3 times before. It wasn't that he was extraordinarily charming. It was that the victim's deep wanting to believe never fully died, even after the concrete evidence arrived. You had to actively, brutally kill it yourself, over and over, faster than it could regenerate in your heart. "I love you," he whispered into my hair. "Whatever happens." I've turned that specific sentence over in my mind more times than any other piece of evidence in this whole massive case. Whatever happens. Not, "I love you no matter what." It was a calculated phrase, built with a psychological escape hatch already installed inside it. The exact kind of thing you say when part of your brain is already rehearsing the version of events where this whole con goes terribly wrong. "I love you too," I said, staring at the wall. And I meant it exactly as much as he had. Dinner was at 7 p.m. at the resort's breathtaking rooftop restaurant. It was a secluded table Sarah had specifically requested, near the busy kitchen entrance. It was close enough for Miller's plainclothes officer, a bartender named Foster Delgado, who moonlighted doing off-duty security for the resort, and had agreed, for a modest fee and a flash of Miller's badge, to keep an unmarked police radio hidden in his black apron pocket. Vera ordered a wildly expensive bottle of champagne for the table before we even sat down. To beautiful new beginnings, she beamed. I watched her raise her crystal glass with the specific, practiced radiance of a woman toasting a massive financial transaction she believed had already safely closed. I'd spent the entire agonizing elevator ride up, running through Sarah's strict instructions like a pilot's checklist. Keep them at the table. Keep them talking. Do not let either of them check a phone long enough to see the massive asset freeze hit the Swiss account. What I hadn't properly planned for was how deafeningly loud my own pulse would get in my ears once we actually sat down. My hands instinctively found the thin stem of my water glass and gripped it tightly, just to have somewhere to put the violent tremor. Leo noticed immediately. Of course he noticed. Hyper-noticing was his entire profession. You've barely touched your champagne, babe, he pointed out, his eyes narrowing slightly. Big day, I deflected, forcing a laugh. Big couple of days. I'm just exhausted. Across the linen table, Vera was scanning the crowded room the way she'd been aggressively. Scanning rooms for probably 15 years. She was cataloging exits without appearing to look for them. And for one long, terrifyingly cold second, her sharp eyes landed squarely on Foster Delgado's black apron pocket. She saw the faint, rigid rectangular outline of the police radio inside it. I watched something fundamental shift behind her eyes. It wasn't absolute certainty, just the sharp animal flicker of a predator whose whole life had trained her to clock exactly what didn't belong in a room. My stomach dropped so fast, I thought I might actually be physically sick right there at the table. Excuse me, she said abruptly, standing up, her cloth napkin still tightly clutched in her hand. I need to find the ladies' room. 4 minutes. That was the agonizing gap Sarah and I had never planned for. The one wild variable neither of us controlled. And I sat there, smiling rigidly at Julian Vance, across a bottle of champagne that his previous victim's father had, in a sense, unknowingly paid for. I was counting the agonizing seconds in my head, like a bomb technician defusing something with her bare hands. That was the exact moment Miller's warrant finally came through. The federal asset freeze on Sterling Coastal Holdings was live. The massive arrest warrants for Julian Vance and Valerie Vance on multiple federal charges of wire fraud, identity fraud, and filing a false public record were fully active. All of it had been urgently approved by a federal judge who'd reviewed Kevin Park's undeniable financial trail and Elena Rostova's heartbreaking sworn statement from Maine in the exact same afternoon. Vera came back to the table at minute 3. I understood from the flat, completely unreadable set of her mouth that whatever paranoid instinct had pulled her from the table hadn't found anything solid enough to act on yet. It was a coincidence she'd talked herself out of, in the exact same tragic way I'd talked myself out of 3 glaring red flags over 8 months. She sat back down smoothly and reached for her champagne glass. I remember thinking, with something chillingly close to pity, that she was about to learn exactly how that terrible realization felt. I know the exact second the asset freeze hit, because my phone buzzed once in my lap. A single pre-approved code word from Sarah Jenkins. I felt a massive knot in my chest completely. Unclench, for the first time in 26 grueling hours. You look suddenly very happy, Vera noted, watching me closely over her glass. I am, I said, staring right back at her. And this time, it isn't a performance. Detective Miller came up the back stairs from the kitchen, with 4 heavily armed, uniformed officers right behind him. Foster Delgado quietly stepped out from the bar and positioned himself directly between our table and the exit before either Julian or Valerie even registered what was happening. Julian Vance, Miller said loudly. He said the real name, like he'd been, savoring it for months, which he absolutely had. You're under federal arrest. Leo's face did something I'd never seen it do in 8 months. It simply stopped performing. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was raw, frantic recalculation. The specific, hollow blankness of an actor watching a script completely run out of pages. Vera stood up so violently, her heavy wooden chair scraped backward and slammed into a waiter carrying a tray of desserts. This is a massive misunderstanding. I'm his mother, she shrieked, playing the part to the bitter end. You're his wife, Miller barked back. Valerie Vance. We have the original marriage certificate from Reno in 2017. We have Elena Rostova's sworn statement. We have the complete Swiss wire logs. He turned to me, and his gruff voice softened by exactly 1 degree. It was the professional courtesy of a man who'd spent 17 years learning exactly when softness was allowed. Miss Pendleton, you did phenomenal work today. Julian didn't fight the heavy steel cuffs. He didn't yell. He looked dead at me instead and said the only thing he would say to me directly during the entire arrest. You could have just signed the damn papers. I did sign them, I replied, my voice steady and cold. You just didn't bother to read what I wrote underneath your fake name. The 3 grueling weeks after the massive arrest were, in some strange ways, significantly harder than the wedding day itself. A crisis has its own blinding adrenaline, but the devastating aftermath doesn't. Assistant U.S. Attorney Miriam Solis aggressively took the case federally within the first week. Once Kevin Park's brilliant financial trail crossed state lines through the Swiss intermediary account, it turned standard wire fraud into something with massive, terrifying teeth. They were looking at severe RICO exposure, given the undeniable pattern across 4 states and at least 3 prior ruined victims. Solis was the rare kind of terrifying prosecutor who meticulously read every single page of every exhibit herself, instead of lazily trusting a clerk summary. She called me personally, late on a Tuesday night, to walk through what Exhibit D, my handwritten notation on the fraudulent transfer document, would mean for the grand jury case. It's not just evidence of the fraud itself, she told me, her voice crackling over the phone. It's undeniable evidence that you identified it in real time, under extreme duress, while wired for the federal government. Juries strongly respond to that kind of courage. It shows deep premeditation on their side and absolute clear-headedness on yours. Clear-headedness was definitely not the word I would have used for myself at any point in that chaotic 26-hour window. But I understood what she meant. Elena Rostova flew down from Maine to give a grueling deposition, and I met her once, briefly, in a sterile hallway outside Solis's office. She was maybe 10 years older than me, carrying herself with the specific, quiet steadiness of someone who'd already survived the hardest part of this nightmare, entirely alone, and without a federal badge to fall back on. I used to think it was entirely my fault for believing his lies, she told me quietly, clutching a styrofoam coffee cup. Do you feel that way? Some days, I said honestly, looking at the floor. It's not, she said firmly, forcing me to look at her. It was never that. Don't let them take your trust in yourself, too. I believed her, more than I'd believed almost anything else that entire month, because she had absolutely no reason left in the world to be kind to a stranger, except that it was the truth. A tenacious local investigative reporter broke the broader pattern story 2 weeks after the arrest. 3 states, 3 fake marriages, 1 disbarred attorney building the entire fraudulent paper trail underneath all of it. The reporter had spent 4 exhausting days combing obscure county marriage records across state lines before she finally found the Reno certificate that made Valerie's real identity entirely undeniable to anyone reading the front page. Her explosive report was the exact thing that finally pressured the small-town Maine Police Department to reopen Elena's original complaint. It was 3 years too late to matter for her stolen house, but early enough to add another massive charge to the sprawling federal indictment. Silas Thorne, the disbarred attorney, was indicted separately in Georgia 2 months later on massive related fraud charges. Kevin Park's relentless trail led federal investigators straight to 2 more incorporation filings bearing Thorne's greasy fingerprints. They were tragic cases involving other fake names, other cities, and other trusting women whose paperwork had looked just airtight enough to survive a sleepy first glance. The absolute hardest conversation wasn't with a seasoned detective or a ruthless prosecutor. It was with my father, 6 days after the ruined wedding. We were sitting across from each other at his kitchen island, a massive folder of everything Miller's team had assembled sitting between us. I tried to tell you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, not unkindly. I know, Dad, I whispered, tears finally spilling over. I'm not saying that to be right. I'm saying it because I need you to know I saw it, and I still couldn't get you to see it. And that's going to sit heavy with me for a very long time. It's not your fault either, I said, wiping my eyes. And I meant that in the exact same way Elena had meant it about me. He reached across the marble table and put his rough, calloused hand over mine. The exact same hand that had signed the fraudulent property transfer. The exact same hand that had written the damning sentence that ended it all. You caught it, he said softly. That's the part I keep coming back to. Whatever else happened, you caught it before it took everything from us. That wasn't entirely true. It had already taken something massive, just not the physical property. It had taken 8 months of my life, a lavish wedding, and whatever innocent version of me had believed just 3 days earlier that fast could still mean real. But I understood what he meant. For the first time since the registrar's frantic call had come through, I let myself feel something close to steady. The plea deal came 4 grueling months later. Julian Vance pled guilty to massive wire fraud and identity fraud across 2 federal districts. He accepted a harsh sentence of 11 years in federal prison, with massive restitution ordered to Elena Rostova and to my father's estate to cover the exorbitant legal costs. Valerie Vance, Valerie Thorne, it horrifyingly turned out, was her maiden name. And Silas Thorne was, in fact, her biological brother. That sickening detail recontextualized the entire mother-in-law performance into something much closer to a twisted family business than I'd ever let myself imagine. She pled to a lesser set of charges and received 4 years, getting significant cooperation credit for immediately turning around and testifying against her own brother. The marriage itself was completely annulled, not divorced, on strict grounds of fraud. That legal distinction mattered to me more than I ever expected it to. A divorce implies that something real existed and broke. An annulment legally says, correctly, that absolutely nothing real had existed to break in the first place. I kept my own name. I'd taken his briefly on the marriage license, and I had it aggressively struck from every single public record within the month. It was a small, tedious, bureaucratic task that felt disproportionately like reclaiming my soul. It's been 11 months now. I still work for the Treasury Department, though I requested a permanent transfer to a newly formed unit that focuses specifically on complex romance and marriage fraud. It didn't fully exist as a formal division until Solis and Miller both wrote aggressive letters recommending one be built around exactly the kind of horrifying pattern that had almost taken my father's property. Fast marriages, deeply manufactured family relationships, targeted coastal or inherited assets, and a paper trail built to survive a glance, but never a forensic read. Elena and I talk sometimes. Not often, but enough. She's slowly rebuilding her life in a small rental 2 blocks from the duplex she lost. It's close enough to see it from her porch on clear days, which she says is either absolute torture or intense motivation, depending on the week. I don't have a neat, poetic line about healing scars, because the truth is always much less cinematic than that. Some mornings, I still check my own bank statements twice, out of sheer panic. It's a habit that used to be strictly professional, and is now something much closer to deeply personal trauma. Some mornings, I don't think about any of it at all, which felt completely impossible for the first few months, and now happens more often than it doesn't. What I do have is this. The thin manila folder the registrar handed me that very first morning is still sitting in my bottom desk drawer. The 2 pages that started the collapse of all of it. And on the second page, underneath the fake case number, in the registrar's own frantic handwriting, is a tiny note I didn't even notice. Until months later. It was something she must have scribbled down before I even walked into her office. A warning from one woman to another. Some people build their whole future on someone else's signature. Make sure it's yours. I signed my name exactly 1 more time after that. On the massive annulment paperwork, on the federal restitution filing, and on the legal transfer letter reversing every single fraudulent document Julian Vance ever dared to put in front of me. On each one, in small, deliberate print, underneath my name, I added the exact same 4 words. It was more for myself than for any official court record, a reminder of the day I took my life back.